We have a few minutes for any questions or comments that you might make.
Professor?
Yes.
Owen Herman, a member of the congregation here, CPRC. Excuse me if I just read my question here, because I've a habit of forgetting things that are going wrong. The Canons of Dordt confess that what we call today is the 5 Points of Calvinism. Recently heard you comment that you prefer to refer to them as the doctrines of grace.
I do.
My question is in two parts. Firstly, did the term the 5 Points of Calvinism only become popular after the conclusion of the Synod of Dordt? And secondly, why do you prefer the term the doctrines of grace or the 5 points?
Let me begin by answering the second question that he raises. Why do I prefer to call the doctrines confessed in the Canons of Dordt the doctrines of grace? My reason for that is that when they are called the 5 Points of Calvinism, the impression is left that there's an odd small group of church people who are Calvinists following the man John Calvin, and that the doctrines confessed in the Canons of Dordt are the strange, peculiar beliefs of this small, odd group called Calvinists. The truth of the matter is that the content of the Canons of Dordt is the outstanding doctrines of the gospel of grace as taught in Holy Scripture. They are not, therefore, the odd beliefs of a small group of Christians, but they are, and ought to be, the truths believed and confessed by all Christians everywhere who faithfully preach and confess the doctrines or truths of the gospel of grace as taught in all of Scripture. To deny the teaching of the Canons of Dordt is not simply to disagree with a strange small group of Christians here and there in the world, but to deny the doctrines of the Canons of Dordt is to put yourself in opposition to the main outstanding teachings of the gospel of grace as found in all of Scripture. Therefore, I much prefer to refer to the teachings of the canons as the doctrines of grace. These are not peculiar to a small, strange group of odd believers called Calvinists, but they are the teachings of the whole Bible, of Jesus Christ himself and of the apostles in the New Testament Scriptures, as well as by the prophets in the Old Testament Scriptures. The deepest question, therefore, to anyone who professes to be a Christian is not, are you in agreement with the 5 Points of Calvinism? But the deepest question to anyone who professes Christianity is, do you faithfully believe and confess the doctrines of grace that make up the gospel of salvation by grace alone? That indicates the urgency of believing and confessing the content of the Canons of Dordt. Now, your second question, which was raised first, was what? I've lost track of that.
The term, the 5 Points of Calvinism, did it only become popular, as it were, after the conclusion of the Canons of Dordt?
The answer to that question is yes. The name for the content of the Canons of Dordt, the 5 Points of Calvinism, came into being and became popular sometime after the Synod of Dordt. Dordt itself did not call the canons the 5 Points of Calvinism, and probably would have declined that name for their confession of the truth. Calvin was quite influential already at that time, and it was recognized throughout the world at that time that Calvin was used by God to express clearly the doctrines of grace and to defend them against the Roman Catholic Church especially. But he would not have been honored by the Synod of Dordt in their naming their creed the 5 Points of Calvinism. That came later, as you suggest. Does anyone else have any question or comment? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's just a question. would a state or a nation have the right to call a synod of the church now in the way that the Dutch state did back in the times of Dordt?
That is a fascinating question, one with which I have wrestled over the years and about which I have written and many others besides. Would the state have the right to call a synod today? My answer to that question is emphatically no. There is not that relation between the church and the state that obtained at the time of Dordt. There is not that relation today, and I'm convinced that it's a good thing that there is not that relation. To my mind, whenever the state interferes with the workings of the church, things go badly for the church, sooner or later. But at the same time, it's undeniable that God, who can make a straight line with a crooked stick, used the state in those times for the welfare of his church. The state had to authorize the meeting of the Synod of Dordt, otherwise it could not have met. The state also had representatives at the Synod of Dordt, both to protect the synod physically and also to lend its influence to see that things went rightly at that synod. And because of the participation of the state, the delegates to the Synod of Dordt were paid for the time they spent away from their own church at this synod. I may mention that in a later speech, but at the end of the synod, the Netherlands, the state government of the Netherlands, gave 100,000 guilders, roughly the equivalent of $100,000, to the Synod of Dordt to be distributed among the delegates for the time they had spent there. So I'm not denying that at that time the state had a good influence and was necessary for the calling of the synod. But the rule is that the state has its own business and ought to mind its business and not interfere in the working of the church. And the church has its business and ought to exercise its business by itself alone. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Could I ask, Professor, you spoke about the fact that the Canons of Dordt are universally accepted within the Reformed Church. When originally issued, and at that time, was the problem with Arminius confined to the United Provinces, or was it a wider issue? In other words, were there other Reformed churches facing the same battle, as it were?
His question is whether the controversy with the Arminians at that time was limited in extent to the Netherlands and maybe surrounding countries, or was it more extensive all over the church in Europe? The answer to that question is that the conflict actually was pretty limited to the Netherlands and to some parts of the United Kingdom. And that's why the United Kingdom had delegates at the Synod who participated in the discussion and decisions of the Synod of Dordt. But the doctrinal issue itself was recognized by all the churches throughout Europe as a danger to them all, even though they may not have had Arminian theologians actively promoting Arminianism. They knew what was going on in the Netherlands, and they recognized that that controversy had the potential to trouble their churches as well. It after all, is a controversy that's found in Scripture. Paul writes in Romans 9 that salvation is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth or works, but of God who showeth mercy. Always in the history of the church, there's this great conflict. Is salvation truly gracious? Is it God's work alone, or is it partly the work of man? Does it depend on God alone, or does it also depend on us? That's the great controversy through the ages. And the men in the other churches in Europe recognize that, and to that extent it involved them as well.